Chapter 7 Living the Dream. February 2nd, Unified Year 1928, skies over the east. Colonel Lurgan sighed deeply as he stared down at the ground in the east. From the window of a transport plane. What has happened here? Despite not being trained in aerial reconnaissance, even Lurgan could see at a glance how bad things were. Bridges had been burned, and while the frozen road surfaces had loosened up somewhat, the remains of what had once been vehicles and people, now reduced to husks, still littered the roads. Lurgan had more field experience than most. Due to his time in Ildoa, he could safely say that he had witnessed the most groundbreaking instance of mobile warfare ever carried out to date. And yet, that experience proved useless now. This looked less like a battle of tactical skill and more like a total artifice, an almost systematically staged alien front. Lurgan felt uneasy. He couldn't make what he was seeing sit right. If he had possessed a mind for both governance and command, like General Zetor, perhaps he might have seen things differently. Does anyone understand the true nature of the East? He muttered, impulsively. An unwieldy feeling of discomfort rose from the pit of his stomach. Was it revulsion at the immense sacrifice below, fear at this glimpse of catastrophe, or just an animalistic sense that something was very wrong? A question that was perhaps better left unanswered. Colonel Lurgan crossed his arms while sitting in the transport, coming to the right conclusion that maybe he was just being dramatic. How is this any different from total war? I can't quite put it into words, but is there something going on here that goes beyond? Somehow, Lurgan peeked out of the plane's window at the ground below and sighed once more. The time for thinking was done. He was too agitated to ponder now, after all. And who could blame him? This jumbo transport plane was about to land directly on a frontline runway. The prospect was hair-raising enough to banish all other thoughts for the moment. By the love of God, just let us land safely, he prayed, though he knew that the only surviving transport captains left in the East at this point were skilled veterans. To be honest, he had half expected such a landing. Considering the alternative of touching down at the nearest base and, worst-case scenario, possibly needing to be carried over some mage's shoulder, heading directly to the front seemed like the much better option. And besides, as rough as it was to land on a hastily constructed battlefield runway, after listening to the pilots boast about how their trusty plane would get him there, as long as they were the ones behind the controls, it was hard to refuse. After all, it was the General Staff who had expropriated so many of their rare transport planes in the first place. Chalking this up to payback, Lurgan managed to resist the urge to shout, "You're not planning on landing this plane, overloaded with so much machinery, on a runway as rugged as that, are you?" Although truthfully, he would have preferred to have a little more time to mentally prepare before touching down, seeing as there was a meeting with Lieutenant Colonel de Garekaf awaiting him below. When it came to de Garekaf, sometimes even Lurgan found it difficult to understand her, but he could easily picture the shock an honorable, patriotic soldier like her was going to feel upon being informed that, due to the absolutely appropriate actions she had taken, she was being stripped of her commendations. Lurgan sympathized. He would even allow that there were extenuating circumstances involved if, for instance, she had an outburst. In any case, for whatever reason, Lurgan was the one forced to deliver this news. He was on tenterhooks the whole way there, his stomach protesting faintly that he, of all people, should do this after leaning so heavily on her achievements while she operated under the banner of Lurgan. Kampfgruppe. How was he supposed to look her in the eye and tell her with a straight face that she was being censured for deviating from protocol? Despite the deep conflict he felt inside, his body behaved as it was trained to do, automatically exchanging the expected salutes with the ground crew before heading off toward a location near frontline command, where the person he had come to see was already waiting. Lurgan could remember how he had gotten there. When his feet finally came to a halt, however, there she was, looking as nonplussed as ever. Lieutenant Colonel de Garekaf. The atmosphere felt slightly awkward, giving Lurgan second thoughts about what he was about to do. He must have been feeling timid after spending so much time worrying over what to say. It took a while before he could muster together some plea for understanding. "I know how wise you are, Lieutenant Colonel. Likely you already know what I am doing here." He must have sounded so pathetic. But the eyes that greeted him were full of assurance, confident in the fact that she had admirably fulfilled her role. Naturally, I assume you are here, Colonel Lurgan, to praise me on a job well done. He doubted Lieutenant Colonel Degorekav truly believed there was no issue with her actions. However, she still seemed proud of the results she had achieved, as she might. It wasn't just Lurgan, even in general. Zetor's judgment, the lieutenant colonel had saved them all. In the end, she had made the appropriate decision. The Empire, its fragile Eastern Front, had avoided being declared dead on the spot by only the narrowest of margins, and the credit, as it were, belonged to the lieutenant colonel, although some of the finer details may have been a bit shady. All the same, that is true, Colonel. I was extremely shocked, myself, to learn that the orders I received from the Director of Operations had not been posted to the Gazette. Imagine a bureaucratic slip-up of that magnitude. But what can one do, I suppose? I understand that, due to the unfortunate loss of Field Marshal Rudersdorf, the General Staff has been in disarray. But as one of those involved in this operation, I must express my deepest regrets for failing to adequately fulfill the role bestowed upon me as a member of the operational staff responsible for strategic direction in the East by General Zetor and Field Marshal Rudersdorf. Why am I here expecting excuses from the Lieutenant Colonel? Thought Lurgan. And why was she concocting them now with such a straight face? What is the point of any of this? I'm sorry, when were you assigned such a position? Lurgan knew he was letting his curiosity get the better of him. There were other things they should be discussing right now. His voice, however, remained incredibly calm, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. Why, on September 10th, Unified Year 1927, of course. What in the world are you talking about? It was just before the unfortunate incident that befell Field Marshal Rudersdorf. I received a direct verbal order from both General Zetor and Field Marshal Rudersdorf. Indeed, Lurgan raised an eyebrow, crossed his arms, and made an effort to speak as openly as he could within the limits of authority and innuendo. Lieutenant Colonel Degorekav. Sir, we can dispense with the charade. No, never mind. What I mean to say is, I am aware of the details. In the General's words, you did well. Do you understand what I am trying to say? It is an honor, Colonel. Yes, you did very well. Considering the situation, extraordinarily well. It is clear that things could not have been handled any better. However, Lurgan's tone suddenly grew dark. After a brief silence, Colonel Lurgan spun around, overwhelmed by the Lieutenant Colonel's eyes, and turned his back on her. While facing away, he crossed his arms and sighed in anguish. General Zetor, for his part, described what you did as an impressive feat of no small acumen. He said that both your grasp of the situation and your prescription for action were the work of a dazzling intellect. However, Lurgan continued, realizing he was beginning to groan. I wonder if there was no other way. Although Lurgan knew he was letting his feelings almost entirely dictate his words now, he could find no other way of expressing what he meant at that moment. The fundamental approach was tremendous. But, Lieutenant Colonel Degorekav, surely you must understand that the methods were inexorable. All I did was make a necessary arbitrary decision, within the bounds permitted by my authority, and that is what was so awful. Listen, Lurgan continued. The truth of the matter is that you falsified orders and impersonated authority. It is a serious case of fraud. The results may have turned out for the best, but the ends do not always justify the means. It was necessary. In the face of her firm answer and unwavering stare, Lurgan could only mutter in response. Yes, I will give that it was necessary. Likewise, in the name of necessity, all of your achievements now will be stricken from the record. Be aware that if you protest, it could further damage your military record. This was his personal advice. Lurgan was there to censure her, so it was the best he could offer without overstepping his bounds. However, Lieutenant Colonel Degorekav remained firm, replying with absolute solemnity. Without the homeland, I would have no record at all. Lurgan was left speechless. The preservation of the homeland, she was right. Military records, the army, even the empire itself, would have been meaningless if they had lost this war. Lurgan felt inconsolable. It was only because Lieutenant Colonel Degorekav had been willing to sacrifice herself to save the army that the army now had the luxury to point blame at its savior for breaking the rules. And he, an adult, had to have this explained to him by a child, a mere Child, how was he supposed to respond? Praise her for her duty? Express his respect for her resolve, or feel shame at being so useless at his age? At that moment, all words felt trite. For that reason, he could do little more than bow his head. Forgive me, you saved us all. Tut, it was no big deal. But it was, indeed, a very big deal. And it felt strange to hear her speak so dismissively of it. Who was he to chide such an esteemed military figure? Lurgan sighed. I have nothing but the utmost respect for you. If I were to pride myself on anything, it would be to receive the esteem of a predecessor as illustrious as yourself. You honor me, but if that is the case, perhaps you should receive your praise directly from General Zetor instead. General Zetor, you don't mean that he is coming to the front lines, do you? Indeed, he is coming for an inspection. Oh, and His Majesty the Emperor will be joining Zetor, taking the place of Her Highness Alexandra, who already visited the front lines. But is he coming to blame Tanya, commend her, or merely to rendezvous? I smile in discomfort as I send off my perplexing visitor, Colonel Lurgan, from the command center. So it is not His Majesty the Emperor's visit but General Zetor's, and the Emperor is just along for the ride. The way Lurgan spoke made it sound as if General Zetor was the main attraction and that the Emperor was just an afterthought. The military has certainly rubbed off on Colonel Lurgan. I see. It is not the kind of slip that an officer who had come up from the aristocracy, the logical embodiment of imperial worship, was likely to overlook. For General Zetor to come before His Majesty the Emperor, imperial etiquette would dictate the opposite. Perhaps this is a sign that social values are growing more mutable than before. My oh my, indeed. I can't help but grimace. The empire is changing. The end is nearly in sight. It is almost time to shape how this war will end. Early February, Unified Year 1928, the Ildoan Peninsula, Alliance Command. He must have been lost in thought, pondering how the war should end. Before the man knew it, quite some time had passed. Staring at the fine clock on the wall, this old military man grimaced and rose from his chair. He glanced at the mirror to be sure he was presentable. His uniform was impeccably arranged, not a wrinkle in sight. While the face resting atop that uniform seemed to embody sincerity, beneath the surface awaited a hard-nosed veteran. It was his eyes. They had seen far too much hell to take pride in being a puffed-up figurehead. Well, so this is what I've become. General Gassman, of the Ildon army, stroked his face and twisted his mouth to the side glumly. For someone who was supposedly a military politician, he looked incredibly brutish at the moment. I look like some rogue who has weaseled his way into the elegant back offices of someplace he does not belong, like some sort of pirate boss, even. HMPH. Glancing around the room, he noticed a hat on display that looked as if it would be just perfect for a king of pirates. It was probably a replica, although, on second thought, who knows, it may have been the real thing. After all, the building Gassman currently occupied, requisitioned as Alliance Command, had apparently originally belonged to a trading company. The original owners must have had some strange tastes. The interior was laid out harmoniously, with a sense of exoticism. Each piece was elegant yet seemingly wrapped in its own storied anecdotes, introducing a fantastic sense of color to the bright local patterns of southern Ildoa. Although the room was generally cheerful, shadows emerged to add a strange depth. Of all the things that could be found in that room, a pirate hat, discord amid harmony. A trading house handles ships. Perhaps, rather than the sword of Damocles, they had simply chosen a pirate hat as their symbol instead. In any case, most would likely consider such a thing uncouth. Of course, the original occupants of the house, whoever had so delighted in such a warped sense of design, had already been evacuated, and whatever culture had previously hung about the place had been banished by the tumult of war. A bit of a shame, really. In place of the luxurious goods the trading house once dealt in, the warehouses were now filled with a growing mountain of military supplies. And instead of elegant guests in their best finery, the most ill-bred soldiers and civilian personnel now wandered rampant along the halls. In the end, their use of this place was crude. For better or for worse, the Alliance official who had outfitted the place for command had likely been more focused on practical concerns and capacity. A real shame, for a cultural asset like this General Gassman sighed softly as he sat before an extravagant desk. Made from a solid slab of rosewood. The entire manor had likely been decorated in that style originally, but now that the engineers and clerks had had their way with it, it had been transformed into a tasteless and utilitarian space. It was practically a miracle that this pirate hat, or any whiff of culture at all, remained in the office. Imperial Army and Commonwealth alike, when it comes to stark practicality, some people will go to any lengths. On one wall, a massive map had been pinned up, and the soft lamps had been replaced with garish electric bulbs. The majority of the room, which had once been filled with fine, high-quality furniture, was now savagely and overwhelmingly bare. How repugnant, what a disappointment. Even throwing his general's badge about and surrounded by specialized support personnel and adjutants, the most he had managed to protect was this one good office. He was hardly free to do as he pleased. HMPH. With a cluck of his tongue, General Gassman placed one of his private cigars into his mouth. It was an excellent opportunity to think, as he slowly puffed on the cigar and exhaled hazy smoke. There's something very unsatisfying about it all, he muttered, setting his cigar down in an opulent jade ashtray and stroking his chin. He crossed his arms with a grunt, the seat he occupied feeling less than comfortable. In contrast to the rest of the office, it was a military standard folding field chair, after all, about as eclectic a combination as one could imagine. Like a true alliance camp, even this office was full of random items cobbled together from whatever could be found at the moment. Time is a hard resource to obtain. How should something so precious be used? It was the only question on General Gassman's mind as he turned his eyes back toward the map on the wall. Well now, General Zetor has shown fine adaptability indeed. He was a monster, really. Gassman tipped his hat to the man. He spends all his time, since the start of the war, as a military administrator, and then, when emergency hits, we get this, an artist, an improviser. There is no other way to describe him. When it came to military politics, Gassman was fairly certain he could stand toe-to-toe with Zetor, but when it came to strategy, he knew he did not stand a chance. Gassman had been completely astonished by the way the recent fierce fighting, which had played out over less than a month, had concluded. A massive counterattack, what they termed a strategic offensive, on the part of the Federation Army. This attack, operating Rising Dawn, had been an impressive strategic surprise. A strong, targeted attack on the flank of General Zetor's army while the general was knee-deep in Ildoa. Despite this, however, judging from the map, the Imperial Army must have seen through the Federation Army's intentions completely and had even managed to turn the tables and temporarily envelop the Federation. Instead, of course, their actions didn't rise to the point of a siege and destruction. The results of the fight had been decided. The Empire had not lost. And, from an outside perspective, Gassman admitted with astonishment, it might even appear as if they had won. They had beaten back fate, what should have been an inevitable strategic defeat, through exceptional on-site resourcefulness and operational victory. Gassman could honestly admit that it was not something he would have been capable of. Gassman, the soldier, did not need history to tell him that he was an unimpressive strategist. He was well aware of that fact. Even in his role as a specialist, he barely had the minimum knowledge required. In his own judgment, based solely on the blunders he had made to date, Gassman knew he was critically lacking when it came to the quick decisiveness indispensable for field commanders. Or, at least, he was keenly aware that in that regard, he couldn't hold a candle to the war-addled officers of the Empire. General Zetor is certainly an object to fear. Zetor was one of the finest among them, having snatched such a brilliant victory. The way he had directed things was masterful, a strategic genius of massive proportions such that, as someone in the same field, Gassman could only feel a strange mix of respect, envy, and fear when thinking of the man. But not even such brilliance could blind General Gassman's reasoning. He understood that the general's apparently grand victory was, in fact, a desperate last resort. It was a successful counterattack, a brilliant riposte. The parrying blade struck fast and sharp. On paper, it all appears excellent. But in reality, it was an act necessitated by the fact that the Empire no longer holds the initiative. The Imperial Army had danced its part well. But the Federation had maintained the lead throughout the ordeal. That was still the crux of the matter. Obviously, this was a performance, a trick to give the impression that the Empire is objectively in the leading role. But it is General Zetor's skill in forcing even as the enemy to play along with this show that is truly impressive. There is something to be said for being a charlatan, thought Gassman, absent-mindedly as he toyed with his cigar. Ildoa itself was feeling that fact keenly at the moment. After all, they had just successfully recaptured the royal capital, a massive victory in propaganda terms. As an expert in logistics and military administration, however, General Gassman was painfully aware of what it really meant. In general, a nation's capital is its political center, a center of consumption, not of production, where political prestige and national pride reside. And it was just such a royal capital that Gassman and the Ildone army had now recaptured, something they were, perhaps unfortunately, receiving high praise for. But consider the reality, however infuriating that might make some feel. Gassman calmly began to assess the facts. The Empire had surrendered a large consuming region only after fierce fighting, then leisurely retreated north. To add insult to injury, they had used the hardships of the people as an excuse to transfer an additional large population of refugees from the north to the south as they withdrew. Most shrewdly of all, they had carried it all out in an extremely courteous manner. When the Imperial Army dumped these refugees onto Ildoa's doorstep, the Federation showered them with great volumes of foodstuffs and even luxury goods, giving the impression that they were motivated by entirely humanitarian concerns. If one did not know that these supplies had come from Ildoa's very own stores, then the contrast between the two sides, the Imperial Army providing refugees with a warm meal while the Ildone army greeted them coldly with empty arms, might seem like night and day. There was no telling how far their intentions went, but that bastard Zetor was clearly aiming to sow division in Ildoa. The dedicated trains and special allowances for the refugees were only the beginning. The Imperial Army had even arranged lodging, putting on the perfect front of providing food, shelter, and care to every poor soul caught in this tragedy, sharing what little love and comfort they had. From Gassman's point of view, the whole act seemed blatant. But how many people were going to realize that these resources had originally been stolen from Ildoa? It was all a farce. The Empire had handed over the capital in response to Ildoa's counterattack only after draining the cupboards dry by distributing the capital's grain stores to the general population. Still, it would not do now for people to say that life had worsened in the wake of the liberating army compared to the occupying force. The Alliance army needed to be seen by the Ildone people as liberators. Therefore, while it might deviate from expectations, instead of pursuing the enemy, the Ildone army was now forced to focus on the transport of daily necessities. Meanwhile, the Imperial Army in the north had reconstituted itself using equipment captured from the Ildone army, and was once again fully nourished on stolen foodstuffs. General Zetor was carrying out a strange kind of war. Strange, yes, but beneath the unassuming surface lay a cold and calculating malice. He was a clever rogue with a careful smile, perhaps. Exactly what the political imbeciles of the Imperial Army, who believed force solved all things, needed right now. Whether it is Zetor or the Empire, I have to hand it to them. They are all infuriatingly good at waging war. The Alliance had played them in Ildoa. Meanwhile, when the cat is away, the mice will play. Believing in this adage, the Federation had attempted to deliver a straightforward, conventional blow in the east, but in yet another mind-boggling turn of events, the Empire had completely turned the tables on them. Gassman had no idea what had happened or how, but at some point, Zetor had made his move. The whole ordeal was unthinkable. In other words, pondered General Gassman, beginning to reach a conclusion. The important point is not to fight Zetor. Zetor has nothing against Ildoa. After all, we could always just leave things as they are and assume all is quiet on the Ildone front. However, General Gassman understood the implications of what he was saying, whether he liked it or not. If the Ildone army fought, they would have to face Zetor, but if they didn't fight, that fact would hang over them after the war, likely coming back to bite Ildoa in the ass later. Was it that the Alliance took its shared commitment to shedding blood together seriously, or was it just a simple fact of human nature that no one likes to see their neighbors get a leg up on them? Either way, if Ildoa was to end up in a better position and avoid being side-eyed as a former ally of the Empire, Gasman was going to have to start sparing a thought for what would happen once the war was over. To fight, or not to fight? That is the question, but both answers came with their own problems. Like the innocent party in a traffic accident, Ildoa had been pulled into this war against its will. But make no mistake, they were a party to it now. Naturally, they had to keep the eyes of the other warring nations in mind as they decided how to behave. They didn't want to end up like the Entente Alliance or the Free Republic, did they? Ildoa was an independent actor in both name and reality. The last thing they wanted was to find themselves downgraded to being a participant in name only. A sovereign nation should not expect its interests to be mercifully attended to by its allies, but rather should assert itself as an equal partner whose opinion must be consulted. The only ones going to put Ildoa's national interests first were Ildoa itself. That much was obvious, wasn't it? Therefore, if possible, Ildoa needed to ensure that it remained equal in substance to the Commonwealth, the Federation, and the Unified States as a pillar of the alliance. However, this is where General Gasman encountered a contradiction. If Ildoa threw itself fully into the war would throw itself fully into Ildoa. Their land would be torn apart. For instance, if the full might of the alliance were to come together to fight to reclaim northern Ildoa, they would leave only a burnt-out wasteland behind afterward. On top of that, Ildoa would likely be expected to spill its blood first. Not many people were going to be happy with the idea of spilling Ildone blood in exchange for favor, only to be left with carnage in the end. This was the problem when war intrudes on your own backyard. I truly envy our friends on the new continent. It doesn't matter how bad things get over there, it is still just a fire burning on another. Sure, ideally, Ildoa would have squeezed out every bit of profit they could from the sidelines of this war, but the current situation was no longer so accommodating. I, too, would like to get back the remainder of Ildoa we have not yet recovered, but doing so by staging total war on our own land comes at a high cost. The total war mindset had not yet taken hold in General Gasman's head. As someone who understood the mobilization of supplies, he also knew how terrible it could be when war started to become an end unto itself. In that sense, there was still plenty of exceptional decency and good sense to be found even in this cauldron of strife. On this point, for better or worse, General Gasman remained calm and cool-headed. Though he hoped to recapture northern Ildoa, he also wanted to minimize the cost insofar as possible. That said, we obviously need to shape things to our liking here as well, to win or to perish, while the Empire's and the Federation's extreme fixation on total war felt like the height of madness to someone like General Gasman. He could understand the logic when it came to reasons of state. With that mentality, he was able to work out what might be called a brilliant, though for him completely mundane, conclusion. If the Imperial Army retreats, the recapture of northern Ildoa will occur naturally. In other words, it would be foolish and crude to rush in too quickly just to stub our own toes. While staring at the map and considering the placement of Imperial forces alongside the military and political situations of the Alliance countries, several interesting perspectives began to emerge, what might be better called political rather than tactical workarounds. It was true, General Gasman was not particularly skilled at war. However, he was far more adept at politics than the Imperials were. As a result, once he decided to reject the enemy's preferred stage and made the strategically proper decision to deliver a powerful blow on Ildoa's own terms, a powerful, secret strike against the Empire began to fade naturally into focus. One of the three colonels he was waiting for appeared, and General Gasman quickly initiated discussion. Colonel Mikel, Colonel Drake, Colonel Calandro, I have something I wish to speak to you three about. Thank you for coming, he said, smiling as he continued, though his next words had nothing at all to do with social pleasantries. Colonel Mikel, you are not interested in defecting to Ildoa by any chance, are you? Bring your unit of Federation mages along with you, and I could arrange for the whole thing, under my authority, as early as tomorrow. Just like that, General Gasman had lobbed a bomb into the room. The astonished Colonel Drake quite literally changed color, and even Colonel Calandro, who was staring at the general intently, seemed perplexed. The person in the room whom the offer actually concerned, Colonel Mikel, simply shook his head softly. His face remained eminently calm. We have family back in our hometowns, both myself and my men. Of course, said General Gassman, unable to hide his disappointment. With a sigh, he moved on to the main topic of conversation. Well then, as there is nothing more to it, shall we get down to our wicked plan to eliminate the enemy of the world? What would you three say to making the Empire our plaything? After all, Gassman said with a portentous smile, it is almost time we begin thinking about how this war will end. How to end the war was one thing the Commonwealth always kept in mind. The balance of power on the continent was all to guarantee their own nation's safety. The thick of war was precisely when strategic perspectives were most required. For the people of the Commonwealth, this was as obvious as could be. Hence, their warmakers tended to look down upon the Empire, who had a habit of forgetting this perspective, as amateurs. According to Major General Habergram, this was a valid assessment. In the end, while military force was no more than a tool, the Imperials had a tendency to conflate military and national strategy, making them incapable of doing anything well other than fighting wars. That is not to say that military force is not also very important. Without force, both theory and justice cannot help but be crushed by violence. The kind of person who would punch a devout prince, a prince who shuns military force, in the face is not the sort of person to be circumspect about doing so. But might itself does not make right. To ensure national security, both justice and might are integral. Additionally, if military strength serves the national interest, then, perversely, the state might very well act to serve military strength in turn. It is often the case that strength leads to disaster. The Imperials are the kind of fools who believe an army alone is enough to protect the Empire. In the hands of an amateur, even the most storied blade will only injure its wielder in the end. Thus, when hearing of Imperial army victories on the battlefield, most in the Commonwealth took the news with a grain of salt, believing that recovery was still possible, even after hearing that the Federation's strategic offensive, Rising Dawn, had failed. Habergram, though surprised, was not worried. However, nothing lasts forever. Excuse me, Major General Habergram. A telegram has arrived from Magic. According to the analysis group, it is a matter of top priority. The fact that the Commonwealth had cracked the Empire's encryption was one of their most carefully guarded secrets. The efforts that had gone into ensuring confidentiality almost bordered on paranoia, so much so that the young major from intelligence who had just delivered the document actually believed Magic to be a high-ranking officer in the Imperial Army. When it came to information warfare, given the strange obfuscations and unusual developments the Empire displayed, the fact that the Commonwealth had cracked their code was kept secret among secrets. After taking the missive, opening it, and reading its contents, Habergram could not help but shout out loud, "What, now?" The contents were more than enough to merit being marked as urgent. After decoding, the telegram detailed a tour by the Emperor, with attendant arrangements. On top of that, an urgently marked postscript read, regarding the Council for Self-Government, recognize autonomy and begin transfer of various administrative powers and arrangements for the formation of anti-Federation alliances. Is Zedor some kind of devil? Perhaps he is even someone after our own heart. After their victory on the battlefield, the Empire had granted autonomy to the Council for Self-Government. It was a fearsome play that tipped the scales of the Council, which were still vacillating between a desire to hold onto their homeland and fear of what might happen if the Federation won, much closer to the Empire's side. In the very instant that the Empire had emerged as the favored horse, they had bound the Council for Self-Government to the Empire's fate. Why, this is almost entirely a fraud. War, diplomacy, and strategy alike. If that monster was so capable of this all along, why did he not do it from the start? Almost everything out of Habergram's mouth at that moment was a complaint, but they were also his frank and unvarnished feelings. If the Empire had someone as talented and insightful as Zedor in their ranks, they should have used him from the beginning and avoided such a great war. Indeed, why pull something like this now, after all this time, and, at a moment like this? Why wait until it was already too late? This, of course, was also a complaint, but Habergram knew there was no use grumbling about it now. He couldn't help but lament, the man challenges the very definition of the word genius. Geniuses, however, were only individuals. An individual, however great, was not an organization. An organization could crush an individual. Through sheer effort, things will likely drag out in the East longer than we imagined. Perhaps the reports from observers were not as reliable as assumed. No, on that point Major General Habergram shook his head, rejecting the thought. The officers dispatched were a select group. Furthermore, the attachés to the Federation Embassy, with their experience in volunteer coalition forces, were handling the Federation officials well. Their grasp of actual Federation Army conditions and their reporting on the scale of the offensive were surely accurate. Although it was speculation, Habergram had no choice but to assume that the warnings that the Federation Army had been on the verge of grasping a strategic victory were well-founded. Habergram sighed at the stark reality that now lay before him. It looks like Zetor really did turn everything around in the 11th hour. Habergram was forced to groan once more. If asked for an official report, the Commonwealth Intelligence Agency could state decisively that there were no signs the Imperial Army had become aware of the Federation's Rising Dawn strategic offensive in advance. Magic was quite clear on that point, vouching that the Empire had been complacent, assuming spring, at the earliest. Hence, expectations had initially been high that the Federation's unpredictable Rising Dawn operation, implemented while the Empire's armored units had been uprooted to Ildoa, would blow the Eastern Imperial Army, which was left exposed in both posture and awareness, completely out of the water. Yes, that is what should have happened. But what was the reality? Habergram swallowed back the bitter taste that rose in his mouth. The reality was that, for whatever reason, Zetor had won. Goliath ought to have been felled over the course of less than a month, yet they still stood, healthy and hale. If every transmission from the Eastern Army, Imperial General Staff, and even Zetor himself had indicated spring as the worst-case scenario, the Empire should have been taken by surprise. And yet, somehow, the side with inferior numbers managed to seize the initiative, respond immediately and appropriately, and successfully wage a dramatic defensive battle. As a result, Rising Dawn ended in a swing and a miss, leaving the Empire's field army as alive and well as ever. Any way you looked at it, the outcome seemed almost too favorable for the Empire, the absolute best that could have happened for them, in the sense that nothing more could have been hoped for. What if, thought Habergram, beginning to toy with a dreadful possibility, what if this had been Zetor's intention all along? Nothing in magic had caught their attention, but would it really have been possible to prepare a response to such a large-scale strategic offensive without at least some sign of it showing up in communications? Perhaps it was an independent decision on the ground. No, that would be preposterous. Could a counterattack have been carried out adequately, without faltering or hesitation, entirely through the impromptu decision-making and ingenuity of people on the ground? It was more likely that Zetor had somehow planned everything, although that chance also seemed close to zero, as nothing had shown up with magic. Meaning, assuming they are still unaware of magic, Zetor really must not have known about the attack. As soon as the words left his mouth, a cold shiver ran down Habergram's back. Could it be, have they somehow worked out that we have cracked their code? Habergram began quickly glancing over the classified document in his hand. The collection of already decoded telegrams showed plainly that the Empire was still using the same code as before. These had to be real telegrams. However, could they be decoys? All of them? That's not possible. A portion of units, for a limited time, perhaps. But, for all of their communications, over such a scale, to be deceptions. Yes, it would be like knowing your opponent had seen your hand but continuing to play the game anyway. Perhaps they took notice when General Rudersdorf was shot down. Could the Imperials have been pulling the wool over our eyes this whole time in order to manipulate our strategic decisions? If so, if that was the case, jumping at shadows was par for the course in information warfare, but right now, Major General Habergram felt as if he were trapped in a spiderweb. We have cracked the Empire's code, and they have not noticed. At least, they shouldn't have. If the Imperial Army had noticed, surely they would have changed their code by now. Thinking logically, it seemed as if the enemy must still be confident in the security of its code. Yes, it seemed as if Habergram's paranoia was soon banished by the voice of a cipher officer, who burst into the room, red in the face. "Are you telling me," responded Habergram in astonishment, "that a one-time code was used for the initial response to Rising Dawn, and that the Imperial Army put those orders into action immediately?" The cipher officer nodded, his expression crestfallen. "The issue is that truly one-time codes are pointless unless a one-time pad has been distributed in advance." A strange shift in activity surfaced in Eastern Army communications immediately after the code was used for the first time. "Let me guess, their response to the Federation's attack suddenly improved. Is that what you are telling me?" Unaware of what Habergram feared, the officer nodded, adding further fuel to the suspicions now budding in Habergram's chest. "Yes, sir. We noted a striking change in the tone of orders being issued. From implement previously prescribed defensive plans to withdraw immediately. We also picked up an additional transmission from the General Staff instructing units to follow previously distributed sealed orders." "Yes, I heard mention of that report." "Sealed orders, correct. What was it called again?" "Defensive Plan Number 4. Have the officers on Magic determined any of the details yet?" "No hint of it has shown up in Magic." "None at all?" "None," said the cipher officer, nodding. "Nothing in intelligence reports either." "No such information has surfaced from any of the Imperial Army intelligence sources we have been able to secure." "In other words," thought Habergram, arranging his thoughts, "as soon as Rising Dawn commenced, a unit in the Imperial Army issued orders through a previously prepared code, suddenly instructing forces to carry out a written plan that had been distributed in advance by means such as officer transport rather than through communication networks. Which meant that this plan had been kept entirely concealed the whole time. It's possible that only general officers knew of the plan. Considering how minor the confusion was despite General Lawton's death, perhaps multiple people in their command were familiar with it. How many times do the words, Defensive Plan Number 4, come up on Magic? Even after Rising Dawn began, the phrase, Defensive Plan No 4 Feet has only shown up a handful of times from Eastern Army Command and Imperial General Staff alike. It does not appear very frequently. In other words, it was intentionally omitted, or perhaps there was no need to be explicit on the subject. "We don't know," said the officer, the answer of a specialist who can recognize when he does not understand the situation. "Thank you." Habergram nodded, seeing the cipher officer off before retrieving the bottle of whiskey stashed at the bottom of his desk. Although he knew it was uncouth, he placed the bottle directly to his lips and took a swig. Right now, it was either drink or lose his mind. Without liquid courage, he was going to scream. An immediate, mysterious transmission in response to Rising Dawn. And in reaction to that, the dredging up of a carefully prepared and even more mysterious plan, assuming that this plan was the counter to Rising Dawn. Impossible. It couldn't be. There was no way. Words of denial floated across his brain and then dispersed, the alcohol already taking effect. "I already knew that Zetor is a monster. The question is whether he is the kind of monster who anticipated the Federation Army's strategic offensive, or the kind of genius who was able to respond to it on the spot." February 7, Unified Year 1928, the East. "Oh, Colonel, I'm glad to see you are well." "General." I stiffen up in the presence of the general, who has suddenly invaded the command center. I resist the urge to suggest he might have given me a warning. But while I am still groping for something to say, taken by surprise as I am, General Zetor, as unwilling as ever to forego the initiative, releases a blitzkrieg of his own, as is the imperial way. I stand with His Majesty the Emperor. His Majesty the Emperor. Oh, that's right, I had forgotten that we are an empire. I had heard in advance that the Emperor himself would be coming in Her Highness Alexandra's place to congratulate us on victory. I had also heard that the general would be attending him. However, I was still completely caught off guard. As comments go, mine was not a bad attempt at smoothing over the situation. Unfortunately, the general is a step ahead in this regard. He grins as he catches the meaning of my words. General Zetor is a proper staff officer, descended from true strategists. Shame, Colonel. He spots a weakness, delivers a focused attack, and exploits the gains. You haven't lost your sense of reverence and loyalty to the imperial household, have you? Despite now wearing a von upon your name, the ability to display assertiveness, or rather unshakable aggression, even in the face of unexpected encounters, is the purview of officers. General Zetor stands as tall and straight as if someone had inserted a ruler into his back, his arms crossed. His question, which he asks indignantly with a stern face, is almost beautiful in its form. You were bestowed your honorable knighthood, your position as one of the 12 knights of the War College, by the imperial household, were you not? I should hope you would not forget His Majesty, after being conferred such duty and honor. The words are a sharp and fierce opening salvo, piercing like an auger. But Tanya is a storied veteran who has now survived a penetrating, full-depth campaign. If necessary, I will not hesitate to entrench on the final defensive line and immediately erect counterfire. Some leeway, if you would. I have lost my palace courtesies out here on the battlefield. A bold, noble response for a field officer, and extremely effective against any high-level officer of sense. The general breaks into a huge smile, seemingly quite satisfied. Excellent, Lieutenant Colonel, that is just the thing, he says with a grin, not bothering to hide his delight. Throughout the Reich's history, it is the imperial household that has always been the center, a focal point, at least, to bring together the bureaucracy, government, and the army. However, after a pregnant pause, General Zetor continues. Is that true of today's imperial household? Indeed, I sneer. They do not seem to evince much of a presence. Why, Colonel, how brazen of you, says General Zetor, though his smirking tone belies his reprimand, to imply that the imperial household, the great symbol of the Reich, lacks presence. Surely that cannot be, Lieutenant Colonel. This is all just a bit. The truth is that nothing has been said to merit a true reprimand. We swore loyalty to His Majesty the Supreme Commander. Naturally, we are soldiers of His Majesty. This is true as well. The Imperial Army's officers are His Majesty the Emperor's officers. At the end of the day, the Imperial Army General Staff Office is ultimately nothing more than a counseling body to His Majesty. At least according to the Constitution and the law. I suddenly gulp. Do you mean to say, His Majesty the Emperor's will interposes in every part of this war? Tanya has never had an opportunity to attend the Emperor directly. As a result, I have no idea what sort of military leadership he might have attempted to undertake. Although, on second thought, even I, someone who has few years of my own within the inner chambers of the general staff, had only the vaguest conception of the Emperor as any sort of military presence. As I recalled, when General Zetor was recalled to Central, it was done under the authority of the Emperor, in name at least. But had the imperial household even been the faintest bit aware that General Zetor's return had been related to the invasion of Ildoa? Had they actually had the choice to appoint anyone other than Zetor? Indeed, has the army not long since become self-sufficient? It had seemed that way, even during the late General Rudersdorf's time. I voiced the question forming in my mind. General, do you feel a sense of veneration for the imperial family? General Zetor nodded in grandiose fashion. Need one ask? As a soldier of the Reich, General Zetor is a true and faithful monarchist beyond compare, he answered. As expected, Zetor's words carry many hidden implications. I grow absorbed in thought. As General Zetor of the Reich, perhaps he is fidelity itself, but did that faithfulness extend to Hans Zetor, the individual of the Heimat? As a soldier of the state, he was faithful, but what about as an individual, with his own thoughts and feelings about his homeland? Is that what you mean? Is that how I should interpret your intentions? It is a convoluted question. But beneath the surface of his answer, the general's temperament is terribly simple and clear. I meant it quite literally, of course, Colonel. How else could it be interpreted? I am Hans von Zetor, Honorable General of the Imperial Army. It is a firm answer. At first glance, it might sound like the answer of a good old-fashioned imperial soldier, proud of his loyalty to the emperor. If an average, rustic soldier were to say such a thing, I would not doubt for a second that there was any ulterior meaning. However, there is more to both Tanya and Zetor than what can be seen on the surface, and I know, whether I wish to or not, that in this case it is the unsaid part that represents Zetor's true intentions. General, what are you up to right now? It is precisely because I understand the hidden meaning beneath Zetor's words that I am now so eager to know what compromise he has up his sleeve, or rather, I feel as if I need to know. How will the war end? How will this unwieldy and chaotic disaster be managed? And how deeply will Tanya be involved in it? In response, however, General Zetor crosses his arms vaguely and stares into the distance. Let me tell you a little about when I was younger. If you wish, but what brings this on so suddenly? Both me and that fool Rudersdorf, excuse me, the late General Rudersdorf, I should say. In any case, when it comes to the General Staff, both he and I were outsiders. I sat up straighter at that unexpected word, outsider. Now that the General mentions it, he is right. Both he and the late General Rudersdorf are not exactly part of the mainstream current of the General Staff. Do you know what kind of unit I came from originally? I am afraid I am completely unaware. I should think not, General Zetor says with a laugh. Officially speaking, I came from an ordinary regiment. Obviously, I have made my way up in the world. On top of that, my personnel evaluations always listed me as the academic type. When General Zetor mentions his evaluation chart, he uncrosses his arms and rubs his chin pleasantly. The army has a good eye for people. Which is why, I suppose, you might say, General Zetor's voice sounds amused as he shuttles a military tobacco cigarette to his lips. I was sent all over the place as an observer. In that sense, I suppose they had expectations for me, as a relatively convenient tool, that is. The high-ranking officer's back took on a strange hue as he lit the cheap tobacco and laughed at what a cheap man he used to be. At the start of the war, both the late General Rudersdorf and I were brigadier generals. Well, that is how I received the title of Deputy Director of Service Corps. The more convenient we made ourselves, the more we came to be recognized as specialists, and the further along we advanced. In any case, said General Zetor, laughing painfully, further advancement was eventually closed off for me. Of course, I grimaced, feeling that sense of confinement when the way ahead is barred. It is something any professional struggles with from time to time, and while it was unexpected to hear that this senior officer had experienced similar woes, I knew it was not surprising. A subcontractor to the Service Corps Chief of Staff, underneath the Chief and Deputy Director of the General Staff. This man, now effectively the leader of a country, took an emotional drag from his cigarette. But then, what do you suppose happened? As he spread his arms dramatically and took what looked like a pleasurable, satisfying drag of his cigarette, the old man appeared at once ambitious, selfless, and even a simple actor. The Norden, the Rhine, and finally, Dacia. The General Staff's predictions had been wrong, again and again. The miscalculations of higher-ups can lead to truly unfortunate outcomes, but each time the General Staff failed, I recall how the old general standing before me rose to higher distinction. The truth is that, due to circumstances of system and personnel, seats were left open in certain higher positions, which is how I wound up as the head of the General Staff. From Brigadier General to head of the General Staff. A massive rags to riches story. While Zetor's abilities, of course, came into play, the environment had also played a tremendous role in his success. He happened to be the one best suited to achieve what was necessary for total war while situated smack dab in the middle of it. General Zetor, too important to be considered replaceable, yet eminently useful as a cog in the machine. Someone who should have ended his career as a brigadier general is now the heart of the empire. It's laughable, isn't it? Almost a bad joke, but exactly why it gives rise to a paradox. General Zetor's voice sounds amused as he smiles, seeming to be genuinely enjoying himself. People likely remember me as Deputy Director of the Service Corps. They probably mistakenly believe I was always a key player throughout the entire current war. Is that true? Just as I am about to object, my train of thought screeches to a halt. True, from the elite perspective, Zetor may have appeared as more of a sideshow, but that would have only been apparent if one counted oneself among the inner circle of the Imperial Army. After all, his position of responsibility, his ostensible title as Deputy Director of the Service Corps, had remained unchanged since long before the war started. Sometimes it is easy to overlook the way things change beneath the surface. The reality of the situation was something else entirely. Yes, you may understand that, Lieutenant Colonel, but not many field Officers would. What about Colonel Lurgan and Colonel Uger? I imagine two men of their ilk would naturally pick up on such a thing. Yes, that is a given. After all, they both came up through the standard General Staff career path. On top of that, their time in the General Staff under both myself and Rudersdorf has been long. They were highly familiar with the truth of the situation. Had they understood General Zetor's role from the beginning? Originally, he had been in charge of practical business as Deputy Director of the Service Corps under the Service Corps Chief of Staff, which belongs to the Chief of the General Staff. But at some point, the Chief of the General Staff was replaced, and the position of Service Corps Chief of Staff opened up. And, again, before General Zetor knew it, he found himself covering as Deputy Director of the General Staff for practical affairs, by way of an operational kink in the system by which the Deputy Directors of Operations and Service Corps fell under the Chief of Staff. There is no way that anyone from the outside would ever understand such convoluted changes in the General Staff's complicated internal affairs. With an organization, when it comes to names and reality, there are often many facets determined by odd customs and previous momentum that are difficult for an outsider to fully comprehend. People tend to judge based on surface appearance instead. Now then, a simple question. The person effectively in charge of the Imperial Army at present is General Zetor. His official position is as Deputy Director of the Service Corps, and he has held that position since the war started. What, then, will later generations take from that? This is why I maintain a close relationship with the Imperial household. I take a step back from General Zetor, whose outstretched arms almost make it look as if he is offering a hug. After putting physical distance between us, I hesitate before speaking in an exasperated tone. You are not thinking of a murder-suicide, are you? The root of it all, the one who had started the war, slavishly lurking in the Imperial family's shadows. An obvious icon, someone who would appear to the outside as an even bigger piece of shit than being X. The world was sure to paint him as the enemy. What a ridiculously cliché idea that would be. I think even picture books would feature more narrative depth than that. I only hope the world does not share your opinion, the general says. With a grin. Of course. Something suddenly occurs to me. This is what he was after. A deliberate crime, in the truest sense of the word. Even if the Reich falls, the Heimat can remain. Even if the great imperial government rots, the outcome does not need to be disastrous. And is His Majesty the Emperor prepared for such an eventuality? I ask, shocked, the question slipping from my mouth. This is something, indeed, but I stiffen in surprise at the general's laid-back response. Who is to say? Not yet, I imagine. Wah, what? On the surface, it all appears as a grand victory, after all. The imperial household is openly ecstatic and is now embarking on a tour of the East in celebration. They are going to hold a blowout sale on hopes and dreams for our friends in the Council for Self-Government while they are at it. What a terrible case of fraud. It is unbelievably malicious, misleading. Representation must have its limits, surely. The imperial family truly believes that we have won, and experienced. Hands on the Council for Self-Government's side will pick up on that confidence when the Emperor makes his rounds, even the most irredeemable conman would show some indication of remorse at what Zetor has done. General, you are going to be despised. Why, Colonel, who would ever despise a simple, artless patriot such as myself? The general said, smiling brightly like a kindly old man. But this is deliberate premeditation. You seem to have become very fond of jest and banter, General. The senior officer waves me off, insisting that he had always been that way. Now you're really joking, I say softly, my face completely serious. But your jokes used to be intellectual, General. You remind me of a circus act at the moment. To be honest, I don't find it very funny. Well, I am playing the clown, after all. With the face of a cunning old man, but still an old man, one no longer bothering to hide the fatigue in his bones, General Zetor smiles. This is all part of the job, I suppose. You should try it for yourself. I'm afraid my performance would be no match for yours. Is that so? Asks Zetor, cocking his head before continuing. Well, Lieutenant Colonel, deep down, it is better if both you and I are fools. The best thing for the Empire is a world where soldiers are closer to idle buffoons than they are to valiant heroes. General, you're right, we are getting off on a tangent. The older you get, the harder it is to stay on track. Now then, as for the main reason I came here today, the truth is, I wished to express my gratitude to you. The general quickly bows his head. You did well to act arbitrarily in the moment. You did well to exceed your authority. And, of course, you did well to save the army, says General Zetor, literally bowing as he speaks his mind. We were on a precipice. It was a strategic surprise attack. When I first learned of it, I was certain everything was over. The general stares at me with sincerity in his eyes before bowing again. You gave us a future. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart. What a saving grace you delivered as I wandered in the valley of resignation. I don't see how you can call it grace. Oh, we did little more than tread water. Do you truly think the army has been saved? I do. We escaped total dissolution. As a soldier of the Empire, an old man of the Reich, and as Zetor of the Heimat, I once again thank you. From the bottom of my heart. You honor me, I say, saluting humbly. At the same time, considering what I have seen, I cannot help but comment on the seriousness of the situation. Dissolution, however, has only been postponed. We have only managed to hang on by a thread. In this age we live in, Lieutenant Colonel, a single thread can be the decisive factor. Perhaps, was it better to say we avoided collapse, or that we only postponed it? Either way, for now, the fact remains that we stand. We are nearly destitute, however. War is awful in every way. When you're losing, that is. But not when you're winning. That is the way of people. I wonder, I say, cocking my head. As presumptuous as this may sound, I love peace. As do I, although I am surprised to hear you express such a strong preference. Oh, but I am certain I have mentioned it before. Why, if there had been peace, General Rudersdorf would have been able to publish that picture book he promised me. The picture book I mention elicits an unexpected response from my superior. A look of deep emotion surfaces on the general's face as he chews pleasantly on the unlit cigar in his mouth and fiddles with the lighter in his hand. A picture book. Yes, a picture book. That could be just the thing for after the war. Maybe I will try my hand at writing a picture book next. General, I don't think that would suit you, I say. In response, General Zetor turns away, seeming wounded. What a harsh thing to say to an old man. Even the old should be allowed to dream. Did that pouting tone of voice truly belong to General Zetor? As I stare doubtfully, he takes a slow, savoring puff of his cigar. I would like to leave something of culture behind for the world. Yes, even just a picture book. What a cruel state of affairs, to be laughed at by the young and talented simply for having that thought. I was thinking that your talents are needed in other fields, General. All the same, responds General Zetor, sounding slightly more cheerful now. Whether as a clown or a vagabond, I am only a second-rate artist. Still, the old man smirks self-effacingly. If there are no first-rate candidates available in the world at the moment, then I shall be first among the second-rate. If that is what necessity requires, then there is nothing for it but for me to thoroughly play my part. And besides, General Zetor continues. You know, Colonel Digorekaf, it's surprising. Though you and I may be the cogs in an instrument of violence, it is talk of culture that gets our blood pumping. Who would suspect that this conversation was about the fate of the Empire? Even the leisurely chatter of the salons has taken on a warlike tone these days, I suppose. HMPH, I respond with childish simplicity. The marriage of culture and violence is where the most truly terrifying power resides. Oh, an interesting conjecture. If there were more time, I would love to see it fleshed out into a full dissertation. Unfortunately, now is likely not the time for such things. Regardless, I meant it when I said that I am grateful, which is why I must apologize. I need to ask the impossible of you once more. Of course, I groan internally in disgust, but for a suit and tie like me, the ability to meet any job, however loathsome, with a positive smile and a cheerful disposition comes naturally. Whatever you require, I would like you to continue causing a ruckus. The general's next words are blunt. The illusion of a powerful empire must be affirmed as real for the rest of the world. An easily understood request. I salute in the affirmative, understanding the role that is required of me. Let us use military might to strike terror into the world. Excellent, Colonel Digorekaf. Unfortunately, I cannot promise much in the way of honor or advancement for the time being, but I suppose you may make use of my authority and my name to a certain degree, for which I presume I can expect fitting results. Your good offices are much appreciated. It is the least I can do when asking for something so rash. Now then, if I could have your assistance for a time in the West. The West? I am taken by surprise. Did he just say the West? But the main front is in the East. You do not want me in the East. I look forward to your coming work in the West this time. The West. He was sending Tanya to the West, not the East. That alone was enough to fill my heart with hope. When General Zetor finally decides to pull the pin on this murder suicide that he is planning for the imperial household, there would be plenty of opportunities for Tanya, under his command, to tuck tail and make her escape. Defeat is inexorable, but my superior officer, General Zetor, seems fully prepared to shoulder that responsibility for himself. I admire his sense of responsibility, which apparently extended to self-sacrifice. His is a completely different type of sensitivity than my own, and I find it difficult to understand in many ways, but as a superior officer, he is certainly worth supporting, in the strictest sense. General Zetor goes on, once again mentioning something unexpected. I'm sorry, Lieutenant Colonel. I have already asked far too much of you, but I plan to work you hard, even after the war. Much will be required of you. Without thinking, almost entirely on impulse, I return a salute. It is an honor, General. I pledge to do my best. What a stunning offer. The promise of hard work even after the war, a feeling of relief diffuses throughout my chest. All that time spent slaving away in the sweatshops of the Imperial Army is finally going to be compensated, almost entirely, in the form of a stellar benefits package. I now had a promise for after the war. General Zetor is going to be the trustee, so to speak, in the Empire's bankruptcy. A promise from such a man to work Tanya hard, even after the war, was more than enough to deliver sweet relief. I now have a job lined up for after the war. Nothing is so gratifying as knowing that your contributions have been properly seen and recognized. Feeling a sense of pride as General Zetor returns my salute, I turn to leave with faint tears in my eyes. To be trusted to such a degree. What could make a person prouder? But, more than anything, it's these new prospects after the end of the war that put my mind at ease. I whisper to myself softly, feeling the relief deep in the cavity of my chest. As long as I breathe, it seems there is still hope. The Saga of Tanya the Evil, Volume 14. Dumb Sparrow, Part 2, Finn.